It's December 24th now, and the two strongest sorcerers meet face to face. Since he came prepared, Gojo, with the help of Utahime, enhances the destructive power of his hollow technique, Purple, and launches a surprise attack at Sukuna in order to weaken him. Despite the 120% power output, Sukuna manages to tank the attack with his bare hands, as the building he was standing on collapses from the impact of the blast. With a kick aimed at Gojo's sides intercepted, Sukuna dodges a punch and tries to retaliate, but gets flung into a wall because of Gojo's control over gravity with his limitless ability. After getting flung through several walls whilst lying on the ground, Sukuna realizes how Gojo is amplifying his own mass to increase his attack power. Despite quickly dodging a kick, Sukuna fails to realize how his foe was about to use his technique to lift an entire section of a bridge and then flung it into a building with him still on it. With a gallant leap in the air, Gojo follows through. However, Sukuna manages to dodge the impact. As both of them seemingly float in the air, Sukuna targets Gojo with his dismantle technique, which the latter barely dodges. Distracted by the building that was cut in half behind him, Gojo still manages to parry Sukuna's attacks while a tower falls directly onto the pair. After breaking a window and slipping through the tower, the duo meet on the ground again, ready for round 2 of their deadly bout. Covered in debris, the pair is currently under surveillance, since the entire fight is being live-streamed online by 𝐵𝐵. The Jujutsu High Sorcerers ponder over their battle as they watch, wondering when the duo will start using their domains to fight, and who will have the upper hand when they do. Back at the battlefield, both Sukuna and Gojo have already started using their domain expansion techniques, and they get transported in front of the shrine that symbolizes Sukuna's domain. Since they were evenly matched, their sure hit techniques canceled each other out. The only advantage Sukuna had during this exchange was having his domain extend outside the reaches of Gojo's domain. This led to Gojo's unlimited void being shattered and him left with his neck cut open. Thankfully, Gojo's reverse curse technique helped him quickly recover from the damage, but this was only the beginning. Immediately after, a series of slashes severely injure Gojo, yet despite that, he still attempts to make a run for it and escape the domain in his injured state. Unfortunately for him, Sukuna wasn't going to make it easy for him. With a series of punches and kicks, Sukuna masterfully dodges any counterattacks from Gojo, successfully keeping him within the limits of his domain. Backed into a corner, Gojo's only escape was to rely on forming a simple domain around himself, which allowed him to somewhat avoid the damage he's taking from Sukuna's slashes. Unamused, Sukuna closes the gap between them and suddenly jumps in to drain Gojo of his energy and leave him open to more attacks. With cuts appearing all over his body, Gojo winds up hugging his foe in order to catch him off guard and deliver a shot from point-blank range with his cursed technique, Red. This attack sends Sukuna flying back into the shrine and effectively shatters his domain. It also gives Gojo the crucial time he needs to start replenishing his cursed energy and heal from all wounds. Meanwhile, Yuta lets the rest of the Jujutsu High team know how he thinks Gojo is probably risking immense harm to himself in exchange for replenishing his energy. Basically, the damage Gojo is recovering from with his reversed cursed technique can't logically heal him after using something like a domain expansion. However, just as Yuta says this, on the battlefield, Gojo and Sukuna start casting their domains yet again. Even the narrator explains that when it comes to the battle of the strongest, the rules do not apply, and both Sukuna and Gojo are capable of completely defying logic and all limitations that have been established so far. As they cast their domains yet again, a few things are different now. This time, Gojo made his unlimited void impenetrable from attacks from the outside, but at the same time, Sukuna expanded the range of his domain, and his sure hit effect inside the domain was abandoned in favor of extending his malevolent shrine and allowing slashes from outside instead. While exchanging blows and dodging each other, Sukuna manages to get close to Gojo and actually land a hit on him, which in turn nullify Gojo's limitless ability. Immediately after, Gojo's domain collapses from the slashes outside, and the pair go back to square one. After the collapse of his domain, Gojo gets struck by several slashes from Malevolent Shrine, and yet somehow tanks them using the secret technique called Falling Blossom Emotion, an ability passed down by the 3 big clans that allow a person to successfully mitigate damage from enemies' domain expansions. Instead of recovering with his reversed cursed energy, Gojo casts his domain yet again, but this time he condenses its barrier to the size of a basketball in order to strengthen its barrier. This was only possible because of Gojo's prior experience from being trapped inside the prison realm, as he was able to visualize and create such a condensed barrier. Despite attacks from Malevolent Shrine from the outside, the barrier held out until Gojo simultaneously landed a decisive blow that wounded Sukuna enough to make his domain dissipate. After attempting to run away and recoup, Sukuna gets chased down by Gojo, who's wondering to himself why his foe seems to be holding back this entire time. Then, without delay, both combatants simultaneously cast their domain expansions yet again. Again, Gojo uses the barrier to force Sukuna into focusing on attacking it from the outside rather than using his slashes on the inside. Attempting to break down the barrier left Sukuna vulnerable to Gojo's sure hit attacks inside, and hence, when their domain shattered, Sukuna came out with a mangled face and bruises all over. Undeterred by this, Sukuna expands his domain one more time, but not at the same time as Gojo. That slight delay was just enough time for Gojo to land some very devastating blows on his enemy. Now on the back foot, Sukuna had no choice but to stop holding back and decides to use the 10 Shadows technique to summon Mahoraga, a powerful Shikigami capable of adapting to any attacks and countering them. Fearing for the worst, Gojo jumps in to attack Mahoraga, but only to find that the Shikigami had already adapted to his unlimited void in a matter of 0.01 seconds. With both of their domains shattered, the pair stand face to face as Gojo tries to reason how Mahoraga pulled off this feat. Gojo realizes that it was most likely Megumi's trapped soul inside Sukuna's body that took on the damage from Mahoraga. This was the reason Sukuna was holding back. He had no access to using any curse techniques at the time. Confident about the fact that Mahoraga hadn't been the one to finish adapting to Unlimited Void, Gojo attempts to cast a domain yet again before realizing that his brain is at its absolute limit. With blood gushing out of Gojo's nose, Yuta confirms his earlier suspicion Gojo was actually damaging his own brain in order to replenish his cursed energy all this time. Gloating over the fact that he outwitted his opponent in terms of endurance, Sukuna decides to deliver the finishing blow by using his domain expansion for the 5th time. Unfortunately for him, the malevolent shrine shatters as soon as he casts it. Sukuna begins to bleed profusely from every orifice on his face, which shows Gojo that he can still manage to squeeze out a victory against his foe. Gojo immediately rushes in to beat the pulp out of Sukuna and lands a series of blows against him. His onslaught is ineffective, however, due to the fact that Sukuna was now using Mahoraga's abilities to adapt to Gojo's techniques. With only 3 spins left on Mahoraga's wheel, before Sukuna allows the Shikigami to adapt to Gojo's Limitless, the latter realizes that he must end the fight before that happens. With a few devastating blows using both his blue and reversed red techniques, a surprise attack opens Sukuna up to receive a massive black flash punch to the gut that almost takes him out. Unfortunately, Mahoraga's wheel concludes its final rotation, and thus the Shikigami successfully lands a blow on Gojo while Sukuna slips away to heal from his injuries. Despite how bleak everything looks, Gojo still kept up the pace and started chipping away at Mahoraga before Sukuna intervenes to protect his only offensive tool. Instead of focusing on the monster in front of him, Gojo decides to pursue a recovering Sukuna, only to get struck by his piercing blood technique. Realizing that he's got the advantage, Sukuna ups the ante and summons a fusion beast made from his other Shikigami. Together, all 3 of them begin to attack Gojo and create openings to deliver decisive blows on him. Gojo keeps up with their offense and defends himself fairly well, but his red technique was proven to be completely ineffective against something as strong as Mahoraga. Knowing this, Sukuna's strategy during this exchange was to make sure Gojo had no openings to launch his ultimate hollow purple technique. Before long, Mahoraga's wheel performs 5 rotations yet again, and this time, the beast manages to completely sever off Gojo's arm from a distance. The 3 monsters keep up their onslaught against Gojo and begin to push him back until the latter decides enough is enough and gets rid of the fusion beast with his blue technique. With the fusion beast now disposed of, Gojo has an easier time holding off his foes and sets up another attack in order to finally wipe Mahoraga out. Completely misjudging the situation at first, the overconfident Sukuna allows Gojo to build up his red technique, knowing full well that it won't be enough to destroy Mahoraga. It was far too late before he realized that this wasn't what Gojo was actually planning to do. With the previous orb from Blue still orbiting in the air, Sukuna orders Mahoraga to go and destroy it before Gojo finishes launching his red. But before Mahoraga could reach it, Gojo used red to launch himself up to Blue and intercepts Mahoraga. Meanwhile, Sukuna aims his piercing blood at red to make it explode and successfully pierces it before getting punched back by Gojo. However, Gojo's incantations allow the red orb to absorb the attack and finish its fusion with blue. The resulting explosion completely annihilates Mahoraga and critically injured Sukuna. Gojo didn't come out of the explosion unscathed either, since his attack wasn't aimed at anyone specifically and hurt everyone in the vicinity. It looks as if it's the end of the road for Sukuna, as Gojo's students breathe a sigh of relief over his victory. However, things soon take a turn for the worse. Gojo finds himself on a bench, talking to all of his peers who had lost their lives to the cause. After a brief moment, Gojo's daydream ends, and he finds himself with his back cut in half. His life essence slowly fades away as Sukuna explains how he never planned on using Mahoraga to kill Gojo. He merely wanted Mahoraga to analyze and adapt to Gojo's techniques so he could later use that information to kill him himself. As it turns out, it was all about adjusting the range of his attack to target the world, the space itself, instead of his adversary. Gojo's students could do nothing but mourn the loss of their beloved teacher as reality slowly set in for them. However, the fight isn't over for Sukuna just yet, as Gojo's death was the cue for Kashimo, the god of lightning, to step in and finally get his chance at fighting the king of curses. Above the battlefield, on a giant block of ice, Uraume decides to intervene in support of his master Sukuna, but gets ambushed by Kinji, who immediately expands his domain. As the ice keeps hurtling towards the battlefield, Sukuna destroys the block with a mere flick of his wrist. And from that emerges a cursed tool formed by Yorozu's binding vow, the Kamutoke. It's the same cursed tool Sukuna used hundreds of years ago in the past to take over Japan. However, despite its power, Kamutoke has no effect on Kashimo, since he was naturally resistant to electricity already. After exchanging a few words, the duo leap into action and start chipping away at each other, before Kashimo decides to pull out a trick of his own, a curse technique called Mythic Beast Amber. With his primal instincts at their peak, super speed, and the ability to use sound as a weapon, the electrified Kashimo overwhelms Sukuna in his current state. With so many injuries to deal with, instead of using his reversed cursed energy to heal, Sukuna uses his trump card and reincarnates himself back into his real form. This mitigated all the cumulative damage he had stacked up while in Megumi's body. As intimidating as Sukuna was standing there in all of his four-armed glory, Kashimo wasn't about to just give up. After trading a few blows, Sukuna started gaining the upper hand in this battle before Higuruma and Itadori decided to step in and play their part. Meanwhile, within the colonies, the calling games are still underway, and Hazenoki just so happened to intrude on Kenjaku, trying to call another player. Without much deliberation, the Reverend gets attacked by Kenjaku's cursed spirits and finds himself fatally wounded by them. Before Kenjaku could deal the finishing blow, 𝗕𝗫𝗁 enters the fray and challenges the sorcerer. With his cartoonish cursed abilities, 𝗕𝗫𝗁 deluded Kenjaku into participating in his daydreams. Distracted by 𝗕𝗫𝗁's foolish antics, Kenjaku failed to sense Yuta's presence behind him. When he realized he was in danger, it was already too late, as Kenjaku found himself decapitated on the floor. He vowed his will shall pass on before perishing from his injury. Back at the battlefield, Higuruma and Itadori descend from above, ready to carry out the plans they've made with the rest of their peers. Against the biggest threat Japan has ever faced, the battle starts. First, Mei attempts to use one of her kamikaze crows to create an opening and potentially harm Sukuna. Unfortunately, Sukuna easily dodges her attack and then continues to evade Higuruma's giant gavel as well. In between all of that, Yuji also launches an attack at Sukuna, but gets blocked easily, while Higuruma uses the chance to cast his domain expansion. Unsure of whether his deadly sentencing is even powerful enough to take Sukuna's abilities, he gives it a shot anyway and begins the trial. After some deliberation with Judge Man, the cursed spirit holds Sukuna accountable for the mass murder that occurred during the Shibuya incident. Due to this verdict, Higuruma attains the Executioner's Sword just as planned. However, unfortunately for him, Sukuna was holding a cursed object at the time, so instead of his slashing abilities being taken, his cursed tool Kamutoke ends up being confiscated instead. This realization came too late to Higuruma, since he was already wounded by several of the slashes he wasn't prepared to face. It's here that all students gang up on Sukuna and try to overwhelm the villain. First, Kasukabe decides to step in and use his simple domain in order to mitigate the damage from Sukuna's curse technique. At the same time, Shozo shoots a ray of his piercing blood at Sukuna, but gets annihilated instead with a brutal gut-piercing chop through the stomach. In order to save his ally, Inu threw Nanami's blade at Sukuna and caught it upon deflection to land a big blow blow on the villain. His plan failed, however, as he got kicked back with enough force to keep him out of the way for a while. Realizing that this is their chance to strike while Sukuna's distracted, Kasukabe and Yuji try to close the gap, but get attacked by the slashes yet again. Jumping over Kusakabe's back, 𝐵𝐵𝐴 launches a surprise attack, but gets caught and thrown away instead. Chasing after the only curse tool that can do any damage to him, Sukuna corners 𝐵𝐵𝐴 inside a building before getting wrapped up in his domain expansion yet again. The domain mitigated the damage from Sukuna's slashes, but couldn't keep the tyrant at bay while he proceeded to disintegrate the ground around them. Yuji and 𝐵𝐵𝐴 didn't stand a chance against their foe, as Yuji got a huge chunk of his side cut off with cleave and was thrown away effortlessly. Now on his own, 𝐵𝐵𝐴 did his best to dodge Sukuna's attack and tried to deliver the killing blow with his executioner's sword, but his speed and combat abilities just weren't polished enough for him to successfully land any hits. With his arms cut off from a couple of dismantle attacks, Choso's distraction allowed him to quickly regenerate his arm. Finally delivering a cut, 𝐵𝐵𝐴 breathes a sigh of relief, only to find out that Sukuna had preemptively cut his own arm off in order to not let the executioner's sword pierce him. Sadly, that last attempt at Sukuna's life was all 𝐵𝐵𝐴 could manage before dying in a rather gruesome fashion while passing on the baton to Yuji and the others. Yuji relishes the opportunity and immediately strikes at Sukuna with the curse tool he picked up, but by that point, the executioner's sword had already faded away following 𝐵𝐵𝐴's death, with no time to mourn his fallen comrade. Yuji gets punched and slashed away several times, while Ui and Kirara get to work by teleporting the injured and the dead away from the battlefield. Suddenly, a glowing orb appears in front of Sukuna, and Yuji's Kogane begins to explain how there's a new rule added in the culling games. This rule allows Megumi to decide whether to go ahead with the merger between Tenjin and the mankind. Since Sukuna is occupying Megumi's body, he decides to eat the orb with Tenjin inside and initiates the merger in front of Yuji, Kusakabe, and Inu. He declares that he will annihilate everyone present, including the new monsters that the Japanese folks would turn into. However, out of nowhere, Yuta intervenes and apologizes to Yuji for being so late to the battle. With debris flying all around them, Gojo's successor and Sukuna go at it head to head before Rika appears and grabs Sukuna before he could harm Yuta. After greeting the Queen of Curses, Sukuna merely rips her arm off and then breaks apart Yuta's sword. Letting go of his blade to keep one of Sukuna's arms occupied, Yuta lands a blow that was blocked by his third arm, while Rika kept the other two arms busy as well. While trying to create openings for himself, Yuta dodges some of Sukuna's cleave attacks and finally casts his domain expansion, True Love. On the ground lay a wide array of katanas that symbolize all the curse techniques that Yuta can copy. After arming himself with one of them that has Takako's thin icebreaker technique, Yuta lands a big blow on Sukuna. Inside Yuta's domain, Yuji is also present by his side, ready to pounce at the King of Curses any chance he gets. Even though Yuta, Rika, and Yuji ganged up on him together, Sukuna still managed to dodge most of their attacks. Yuta decides to use cursed speech against Sukuna and also attacks the villain with thin icebreaker again, which sends Sukuna flying into a pillar, where Rika lands another punch on him. With a couple more exchanges with his enemies, it looks like Sukuna gained the upper hand again. However, not giving up, Yuta uses Charles Bernard's G War Staff technique to see a second into the future in order to intercept and deal some damage against Sukuna. His plan seems to work as Yuta and his allies begin to pummel away at the villain. Tugging on the air with Yuro's technique, Yuta blinds Sukuna only for a moment to deal some damage with his katana before it gets caught regardless. Despite that, Yuta still has another trick up his sleeve, a copied version of Sukuna's cleave. Seeing an opening, Yuji and Yuta begin to relentlessly pummel away at Sukuna, slowly subduing his arms. Yuta then goes on to cut off one of them and cuts open Sukuna's mouth in order to make sure the sorcerer can't use any hand signs or incantations to strengthen his curse techniques. Despite being held down by Rika and Yuji, and despite getting hit by a maximum output Jacob's ladder, Sukuna wasn't finished quite yet. Inside his body, Yuji's fists finally managed to reach out to Megumi's soul, trapped deep inside. As if he had resigned to his fate, Megumi rejects Yuji's pleas to take back control of his body and gives Sukuna full control over, which results in a series of slashes that landed on Yuji and his allies. During the commotion, a sudden blade pops out from Sukuna's chest, and it turns out that Maki was secretly inching closer in order to land a devastating surprise attack from behind. Instead, seconds, the domain around them shatters, and Sukuna remains unaffected by the sword in his chest. He critically wounds Yuta with his dismantle, which prompts Rika to abandon the fight and fly away with him in order to protect him. 𝐸𝐸 appears and teleports both of them away from the battlefield, while Maki steps up to the plate and challenges Sukuna as the others look on. Yuji tries to assist her, but falls to the ground while bleeding from his mouth, exhausted from his efforts to bring Megumi back to his senses. A revived Chozo appears and puts his hand on his little brother's back and asks him to remain calm and breathe in order to recover from his injuries. Maki holds her own against Sukuna fairly well with her incredible combat prowess and even manages to dodge Sukuna's earth-cutting dismantle attack. Meanwhile, Uraume and Kinji discuss the state of the battle occurring nearby. As stated by Uraume, despite all sorcerers working together, Sukuna still isn't going all out. Back at the main battlefield, Maki continues to battle Sukuna. However, her efforts are in vain as she gets swatted away like a fly before Inu decides to intervene. Sukuna predicts Inu's attack and kicks him out of the building they're in, but is confused over the fact that Inu wasn't carrying Nanami's sword. It's at that time that Kusakabe lunges at him from above, carrying the sword. Predicting the second surprise attack, Sukuna grabs Kusakabe and plants him into a wall before Maki uses her full force to punch Sukuna away from her ally, sending him flying. Maki continues to pursue Sukuna, but her attacks don't seem to do any real damage to him. Eventually, Sukuna lands a black flash directly on Maki and sends her flying away, presumably killing her with the devastating blow, while Kusakabe is left shocked by what just transpired. With his sword drawn, Kusakabe casts a simple domain around himself in order to parry Sukuna's techniques. Although his strategy works out for a while, he soon gets defeated as well. 𝐸𝐸 suddenly teleports to the battlefield to recover the body, but Sukuna is right there waiting for him to strike him down as well. Before he could land the killing blow, however, Miguel shows out just in time to save the boy. Presuming that they had the upper hand, Miguel and Laru step into the battle against Sukuna and use their abilities to legitimately tear down his defenses. Their efforts seem to pay off, but Sukuna refuses to back down despite getting impaled by one of Miguel's attacks. Chozo also enters the fray again and fires off his piercing blood, only to get slashed by Sukuna while Yuji launches a surprise attack from above. Suddenly, before Sukuna could use his hands to amplify his cursed technique, Maki reappears and severs both of his right arms with a surprise attack. However, this attack does not slow down Sukuna at all, and with one successful black flash, Laru gets fatally wounded. Despite tanking multiple attacks from all of the combatants on the battlefield, Sukuna still kept up his speed and endurance. By the end of their exchange, Maki gets hit with yet another black flash and an onslaught of slashes to go along with it. Sukuna then appears behind Chozo, throws him into a wall, and delivers a black flash right into his stomach, but the damage gets neutralized by Chozo's blood manipulation. With Yuji coming back for more, Laru and Miguel finally decide to go all out against Sukuna in order to support the Jujutsu High Sorcerers with their lives on the line. Yuji attempts to land Black Flash on Sukuna, but the King of Curses easily sees it coming. However, before he could dodge the attack, Laru uses his cutie honey technique to pull Sukuna's gaze towards him, thus giving Yuji the chance to land a critical blow. One after another, Yuji delivers 2 Black Flash punches on Sukuna before using Shrine. This surprises Sukuna, who deduces that Shrine must have been a dormant ability Yuji possessed all along that came out from using the Black Flash. Grabbing Sukuna's leg in the air, Yuji tanks his slashes and delivers yet another crushing Black Flash to his stomach. Still unaffected by it all, Sukuna gets distracted by Inu's attacks, but before he could deal with the nuisance, Yuji appears behind him and delivers yet another Black Flash. Now fired up, an unfazed Yuji keeps tanking Sukuna's attacks and throws him into a wall. He then lands another Black Flash that completely shatters the wall behind the mighty sorcerer and continues to do it again and again, despite losing an eye to Sukuna's slashes. At his wit's end, with his reverse curse technique suppressed by Yuji's 7 successful Black Flash hits, Sukuna finally decides that it's time to get serious and activates Malevolent Shrine yet again. With slashes engulfing the entire area, Yuji pulls off a simple domain and manages to keep himself safe from the onslaught. However, even so, some of the slashes manage to slip through Yuji's simple domain, and thus he sustained a great number of injuries all over his body, including a severed leg. Once the barrage of slashes ceased, Sukuna prepared his final, ultimate curse technique to bring this battle to an end, his Furnace. Out of nowhere, a massive ray of flames engulfed the entirety of Sukuna's domain. The fire was strong enough to wipe out all living beings inside it, and yet, Yuji survived. He survived because at the last second, Chozo sacrificed himself by using his blood to encase Yuji in a dome that would protect him from the all-annihilating flames around him. In the end, the battlefield was covered in smoke, and even though Yuji called out to his comrades, worried about their safety, only Sukuna responded to his calls. Just as it looked that the fight is done, another figure steps out from the smoke behind Yuji, Todo! Unbeknownst to Yuji, Todo was also a part of the plan all along. His inclusion was kept secret from Yuji just in case the latter still had any connection that could relay information to Sukuna due to them having occupied the same body in the past. Todo informed Yuji that the others are safe, putting his mind at ease. Together, the fired-up duo steeled themselves in order to finally bring Sukuna's reign to an end. Equipped with his re-boogie woogie, Todo's new technique allowed for a faster swap than before, which kept Sukuna off balance for the majority of their fight. Inching his way closer to his target, Yuji manages to pull off yet another Black Flash, and together they bring Sukuna to a point where he considers using his domain expansion yet again. But before that, from the smoke, a silhouette of another individual appears. As the mysterious silhouette emerges from the smoke, Sukuna is left completely stunned, as before him appeared a man who should, by all means, be dead. After analyzing the situation, Sukuna immediately realizes that something isn't right. He soon notices the scars on Gojo's head and realizes that Kenjaku's technique was used to revive the fallen warrior, and the one inside it now is none other than Yuta. After eating Kenjaku's body, Rika gave Yuta the power to copy his body-hopping ability. On his deathbed, Yuta had no choice but to abandon his body in favor of Gojo's, something he'd already made his peace with after talking about it with his peers. Now making his comeback, Yuta in Gojo's body pulls off exactly what Sukuna had feared all along, a domain expansion that can counter his, the unlimited void. Doing exactly what his mentor did, Yuta shrinks the barrier in order to keep Sukuna at bay, but what he didn't realize was that the sorcerer was capable of amplifying his domain simultaneously while expanding it. Thus, Sukuna was able to close the gap between him and Yuta despite the infinity of Limitless, and delivered a devastating blow to his face. As Rika's tears fall to the ground, Yuta finds himself in her arms, back inside his own body somehow. As if it were some premonition, Yuta snaps out of it and uses all of his strength to judo slam Sukuna to the ground and then kicks him away. Realizing he has the advantage, despite not having Rika's strength to rely on, Yuta begins to experiment with his new limitless abilities and yet fails to truly master the intricacies of them. After failing to flick Sukuna away, Yuta figures out the only way to resolve this fight would be to use his mentor's ultimate technique, the hollowed purple. However, Sukuna was not going to make it easy for Yuta to perform such a powerful attack and started to relentlessly beat him down in order to keep him preoccupied. Thankfully, the Jujutsu High team still had a couple more surprises up their sleeves, like an MP3 player with a recording of Toge, commanding anyone who listens to it to stop moving immediately. A cursed speech command that was far stronger than the pale imitation Yuta had used earlier. With Sukuna rendered immobile and helpless, Yuta seizes the opportunity and powers up Gojo's devastating hollowed purple technique. The shockwave of Yuta's attack utterly destroys the domain expansion and the buildings surrounding them. However, Sukuna jumps back, seemingly avoiding all damage. Since Yuta wasn't completely attuned to Gojo's body, he wasn't able to launch purple properly, which heavily weakened the technique. Immediately after, from the smoke, Yuji and Todo jump out to give Yuta some backup, but in that moment, Yuta collapses due to exhaustion and being burned out by his new techniques. Despite that, he still managed to keep the barrier up as Yuji and Todo prepare to engage Sukuna in battle yet again. With Todo distracted while he looks back at Yuta, Sukuna quickly lands a devastating Black Flash and sends him flying away, gritting his teeth. Todo still manages to use Boogie Woogie and suddenly teleports Yuji behind Sukuna, giving him an opening to land a strong punch on the villain. With the help of the barrier, Todo uses his technique to keep Yuji popping in and out of Sukuna's range. Then, suddenly, seeing his chance, Yuji extends his hand out and uses Dismantle on Sukuna's body, specifically targeting his connection to Megumi through the use of a binding vow. Fearing for his safety, Sukuna decides to jump back, but Yuji pursues him relentlessly. Lunging at him, Yuji prepares a punch but gets swiftly swept back into a building. Once Todo catches up to them, Sukuna prepares for yet another swap, but realizes that he was tricked as Angel appears above him and prepares to launch another Jacob's Jacob's ladder in order to exorcise him from Megumi's body. Anticipating the damage, Sukuna punches the ground hard and starts climbing the resulting debris through the attack. Angel tries to get away, but she is not fast enough. That's when Todo teleports himself in between and tanks the attack as both of them get sent flying back into a building. With two of his foes taken out, Sukuna breathes a sigh of relief, but not for long as Yuji followed him all the way up, tanking the damage from Jacob's ladder as well. With his fist charged with cursed energy, Yuji lands an impressive blow on Sukuna's face, grabs his legs, and then yanks him back down through a skyscraper. Landing on a rooftop, Sukuna notices Yuji behind him using Dismantle and punches the boy back. Unfazed by the assault, Yuji keeps using Dismantle while Sukuna continues to dodge and punch him back. Desperate to reach Sukuna, Yuji finally unveils his trump card, something he learned while training with Kusakabe, his own domain expansion. Suddenly transported to a train station, Yuji leads Sukuna through his hometown and shares stories with him about his past and his thoughts. Their peaceful walk through the town goes sour, however, when Yuji makes it clear that he pities Sukuna and wants to grant him mercy if the King of Curses accepts to go back inside his body. Enraged by this transgression, Sukuna grits his teeth and declares he'll eradicate anyone Yuji holds dear right in front of his eyes. Meanwhile, Yuji finally gets through to Megumi's soul, and they discuss letting go of the past and looking forward to the future instead. Suddenly, Sukuna pulls a play out of Gojo's book and casts a simple domain, Hollow Wicker Basket, in order to get out of Yuji's domain. Undeterred, Yuji continues his onslaught, confidently grabbing Sukuna's leg and then delivering an elbow directly onto his knee. Sukuna calmly starts wailing on Yuji in retaliation and sends him flying back. Suddenly, with a blow to Sukuna's face, Yuji realizes that the cursed spirit's hold over Megumi's body is slowly weakening. After a flurry of punches, the two grab each other's heads and start belting out punches as Sukuna's defenses begin to erode under the weight of Yuji's attacks. Exhausting his curse technique and bleeding profusely through his nose at this point, Sukuna realizes it's time he tries to expand his domain yet again. Before that can happen, however, we learn that Sukuna's last finger, the one he thought was consumed by Rika, was actually in possession of Jujutsu High Sorcerers all along. The one Rika consumed was actually Yuji's finger, hence he is missing the two fingers now. Back at Jujutsu High, an old familiar face prepares to use her cursed technique on Sukuna's finger. Nobara, revealed to be alive, using her resonance technique, subdues Sukuna long enough to prevent him from using his domain. Prepared to end the fight once and for all, Yuji delivers another devastating black flash straight into Sukuna's stomach. Inside Megumi's body, Sukuna tries to steer the boy away from undoing his shackles, but Megumi resists the cursed spirit and finally manages to expel it from his body. With Yuta's domain still active around them, Yuji's punch sends Megumi's body flying back as his body rejects Sukuna's presence. Now in a completely vulnerable state, Sukuna is nothing but a shell of his former self. Yuji offers the King of Curses mercy and begs him to stop the senseless resistance and return to his body. But Sukuna's pride was not about to let him take that option. Fading away in Yuji's hand, Sukuna ceases to exist. On the other side of the battlefield, Uroume and Hikari decide to end their battle now that Sukuna is no more. After exchanging a few words, Hikari watches as Uroume's body turns to ice and shatters into pieces, and thus ends the conclusive final battle between the strongest sorcerer and the rest of the modern Jujutsu world.